Welcome to this webinar from the Asia Pacific Centre for the Responsibility to Protect. This is a webinar designed for those working in human rights, peace building, and atrocity prevention. This webinar will provide an introduction to the responsibility to protect and the 4 atrocity crimes. This webinar will be delivered by Dr. Noel Morada from the Asia Pacific Centre for the Responsibility to Protect, who are bringing you this webinar.
First, I'd like to introduce how the idea or concept of R2P started. Because of the collapse of the Cold War and the Soviet Union, the concept of security moved from state-centered to people-centered. And by that, we mean that there's now focus after the Cold War to internal armed conflicts within states. As we can consider in the post-Cold War situation, there are a lot of states that continue to face challenges to their legitimacy based on armed conflicts. So there are internal armed challenges. Now, after the Cold War, there's also a new focus on human security and human development. Now, why is this very important? It's because states started to realize that internal armed conflicts have what you call root causes, and many of these are rooted in human security issues like poverty, access to justice and basic services, and that also include human rights. So from the liberal humanitarianism perspective, after the Cold War, the focus has moved also to ideas or principles related to good governance, democracy, and human rights. It's also important to consider that after the Cold War, there were many failed states that brought about humanitarian crises. And many of these were due to internal conflicts, particularly in Africa, like Rwanda, Democratic Republic of Congo, Cote d'Ivoire. And then in the former Yugoslavia, you have Bosnian Serbs and Croats, and then also atrocities that were committed in Srebrenica. So failed states brought about humanitarian crises in Africa and other parts of the world, and internal armed conflicts led to atrocities. Also, it's important to look at the spillover effects of these internal armed conflicts. Neighboring states where internal armed conflicts and atrocities are happening, there were a number of internally displaced persons fleeing conflicts, and they became refugees. And also they became victims of human trafficking, and victims were primarily women and children who were also escaping not just the armed conflict but also sexual violence. The continuing relevance of responsibility to protect also extended beyond the late 1990s and into the 2000s, particularly after 9/11, the terrorist attacks in the US, as well as in other parts of the world. So refugees from Afghanistan and Iraq, you also have the Arab Spring since 2011. You have cases of atrocities being committed in Libya and Syria since 2011. And of course, the atrocities being committed by non-state actors such as ISIS. They were also committing atrocities in Syria and Iraq, for example, against the Yazidis, a minority in Iraq. And then in Southeast Asia since 2012, there are also concerns about the atrocities being committed in Myanmar by the Tatmadaw or the military, as well as in the Philippines since 2015 or 2016 because of the extrajudicial killings, human rights violations in relation to the government's anti-drug war. R2P is not a Western concept because it has its roots in African experience in dealing with atrocities. Now, it's also significant to emphasize that the idea of sovereign responsibility, the context is in Africa. Francis Deng, who actually developed the idea of sovereign responsibility, is from Sudan and now a diplomat of South Sudan. The Constitutive Act of the African Union actually also brought the idea of atrocities prevention and responsibility to protect, which provided certain provisions in Article 4H and 4J. This is about the protection of population as a collective responsibility of the African Union. So, what is significant about the transformation of the Organization of African Union to African Union in 2000 is that they moved from the principle of non-interference to non-indifference. Article 4H, for example, stipulates that the Union has the right to intervene in a member state pursuant to a decision of the Assembly in respect to grave circumstances, namely genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. In 2001, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty published its report, which is the Commission's report about the importance of dealing with humanitarian crises and mass atrocities. Now, this report is actually a response to the challenge of then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who asked the question, how should the international community respond to humanitarian crises and mass atrocities? Now, essentially, the report of ICES in 2001 focused on three aspects of responsibility to protect. It's the responsibility to prevent, the responsibility to react, the responsibility to rebuild. But then the report focused more on principles related to military intervention and operations, even though it acknowledged that prevention is also important. Following the 2001 ICES report on R2P, the African states in 2005 adopted the responsibility to protect as part of the Esselwini Consensus, which recognizes the authority of the Security Council to authorize the use of force in situations of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing, and insisting that in such cases, regional organizations in areas of proximity to conflict must be empowered to take action. In the UN General Assembly, which actually provided the opportunity for world leaders to come up with the World Summit Outcome document, and the General Assembly adopted R2P, particularly in paragraphs 138 and 139. If you're going to look at paragraphs 138 and 139, the scope of R2P covers four crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. Paragraph 138 of the World Summit Outcome document also states that it is the primary responsibility of states to protect vulnerable populations. Notice that the term uses populations and not citizens of states. Second, the paragraph also underscored the importance of international responsibility to help states build capacity to prevent atrocities, and also that 139 focuses on timely and decisive response under the UN Charter, or rather Chapter 7, if states manifestly fail and peaceful means fail. You may link R2P with protection of civilians, but it is problematic to equate the two because the protection of civilians agenda addresses physical violence against civilians, whereas R2P refers to wider protection responsibilities for civilians and combatants within specific contexts. This is why R2P is not synonymous with the protection of civilians. Humanitarian intervention may be unilaterally undertaken in the name of protection of civilians or protection of human rights by powerful states. That's why we need to make certain distinctions between these two concepts, R2P and humanitarian intervention. However, if peaceful means and efforts towards prevention are failing, under the World Summit Outcome document, it is the task of the UN Security Council to authorize certain measures, and these measures may include not just the use of force, but also sanctions or referral to the International Criminal Court if the state is unwilling and unable to fulfill its responsibility to protect. R2P is about human security or all aspects of human security, which is not the case because R2P is actually concerned about protecting vulnerable populations from direct harm, which is caused by the 4 atrocity crimes. Now, we need to talk about the 3 pillars of the responsibility to protect. First pillar talks about the use of the term population instead of citizens. And so the primary responsibility of states is to protect vulnerable populations that are within its territory, and that includes non-citizens. So these are the essential elements of Pillar 1, where prevention is mentioned as the primary responsibility of the state. It's also important to emphasize that the prevention aspect under Pillar 1 includes incitement, and that's in paragraph 138. And incitement means that, if there are perpetrators of the 4 crimes, atrocity crimes, they will incite people to commit those atrocity crimes, primarily through, for example, hate speech, and therefore it would escalate into actual commission of atrocity crimes. The second pillar of R2P focuses on the responsibility of the international community to provide assistance to states to build their capacity to prevent atrocity crimes. And the other part of this pillar is that it calls on states not to hesitate to ask for assistance. Now, if a state requires assistance to prevent atrocity crimes, the international community has an obligation to help build the capacity to prevent those crimes from occurring. Now, the third pillar talks about timely and decisive response by the international community under 2 conditions. First, if there is manifest failure on the part of states to prevent atrocities, or peaceful means have failed. Now, this pillar is the most controversial of all 3 because the first and second pillars of R2P are based on consent and collaboration with the state in question, whereas the third pillar shifts towards the right of the international community to respond if the state has failed to prevent atrocity crimes from occurring against population within its territory. An international response doesn't necessarily mean intervention, coercion through the use of force. In fact, the use of force may be considered as a last resort. Other ways the international community might choose to respond include negotiations, backdoor diplomacy, or sanctions. Now, these 3 pillars of R2P actually provide guidance for action in preventing and responding to the 4 atrocity crimes. Now we go to the question of whether R2P and the principle of sovereignty and non-interference are actually contradictory, and therefore if you adhere to the principle of R2P, you're abandoning sovereignty or the principle of non-interference. Now, the thing is that one has to look at R2P as a friend, not an enemy of sovereignty. Now, what do we mean by this? If we define sovereignty as a principle that is linked to states that are promoting and practicing good governance, rule of law, democracy, and human rights protection, then R2P is a friend of sovereignty. When we talk about R2P as a friend of sovereignty, it is also incumbent on states to also seek international assistance in order to build the capacity to prevent atrocities. Hence, it is also critical to point out that if states take their primary responsibility to protect seriously and they address many of these root causes of atrocities and they seek international assistance to build their capacity, then there's no need to fear external intervention under Pillar 3. And the reason why many countries or states are very wary of R2P is because they think or misconstrue the principle of R2P as all about intervention. And so if states address the root causes of atrocities, then they are able to prevent atrocities. And if they still don't have the capacity, then all they need to do is seek assistance, and the international community also has that responsibility to provide assistance to states. Now, the last point, by way of summary, back to the background on R2P, this norm or principle or doctrine does not automatically cascade at the regional and domestic levels. So, what we need are actually advocates or champions at the regional and domestic levels. And these champions are supposed to do work in terms of promoting an understanding of what the responsibility to protect principle is all about. And it's also important to underscore that R2P must also be anchored on complementary local norms or principles that protect vulnerable populations or groups of people. And so therefore, when you look at the responsibility to protect in the context of, let's say, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, it does not really contradict many of the values of ASEAN, because ASEAN, when you look at many of its documents and agreements and norms, for example, in the ASEAN Charter, although there are principles that address traditional norms like sovereignty, non-interference, etc., that focus on the state, ASEAN Charter and other agreements also acknowledge the importance of human rights protection, protection of ethnic minorities, adherence to international humanitarian law, among other things. Now, the last point I'd like to make is that R2P is not just state responsibility, although this is highlighted in the UN document. It is also individual responsibility. We cannot be bystanders if there are atrocities or the beginnings of atrocities being committed. Atrocities do not happen overnight. They build. We can build the capacity of states to prevent atrocities. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this webinar from the Asia Pacific Centre for the Responsibility to Protect.